Before we get into the video, could everyone please subscribe to my HOA Karen Tales channel? Thank you so much. I never thought I'd be the guy with an HOA Karen story, but life has a funny way of serving up exactly what you don't order. My name is Daniel, and until 6 months ago, I was living what I consider to be a perfectly normal suburban existence in Oakwood Heights, a mid-sized community in Northern Virginia. I'm an IT security consultant who works mostly from home, which means I value my privacy and quiet workspace more than most. My backyard had become my sanctuary, a place where I could take breaks between client calls, enjoy my morning coffee, or simply decompress after a long day of staring at code. That was until Patricia Whitmore moved in next door and somehow managed to get herself elected as the HOA board president within 3 weeks of unpacking her last box. I should have seen the warning signs when she introduced herself by handing me a printed list of neighborhood expectations that weren't actually in our HOA bylaws. Just some friendly suggestions, she'd said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I politely thanked her and promptly recycled the paper as soon as I closed my door. Looking back, I realized that was the moment I landed on Patricia's radar as a problem neighbor. The first few weeks were minor annoyances. Notes left in my mailbox about my grass being a quarter-inch too tall or how my garbage bins remained at the curb for an excessive 37 minutes after collection. I mostly ignored these, which in retrospect only escalated the situation. Patricia began stopping by unannounced to discuss community concerns, which somehow always centered around my property, despite my meticulous adherence to the actual HOA regulations. I catch her peering over the fence occasionally, especially when I was working on my laptop in the backyard. It was annoying but seemed harmless enough at the time. Then came the infamous tree incident. I had a beautiful old oak in my backyard that predated the neighborhood. It was healthy, well-maintained, and partially visible from Patricia's second-floor window. Apparently, it was obstructing her premium view, a view that consisted mostly of other suburban backyards. She demanded I trim it down by half its height. When I politely declined, explaining that the tree was specifically protected in our purchase agreements, Patricia's demeanor changed from passive-aggressive to openly hostile. "We'll see about that, Daniel," she had said, her voice eerily calm as she walked away from my front door. The HOA has ways of dealing with non-compliant residents. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of drilling. Looking out my bedroom window, I was shocked to see a man in a Secure Home Systems uniform mounting what was clearly a security camera to the corner of Patricia's house, pointed directly at my backyard. I threw on some clothes and rushed outside. "Excuse me," I called out, trying to keep my voice level despite my rising blood pressure. "What exactly are you installing there?" The technician looked down from his ladder. The security system for Mrs. Whitmore had full perimeter coverage. "That camera is pointed directly into my backyard." I pointed out that's an invasion of privacy. He shrugged, just following the work order. "Sir, you'll need to take it up with the homeowner." By the time I made it to Patricia's front door, she was already waiting with her arms crossed and that same unsettling smile. "Good morning, Daniel. Is there a problem?" "Yes, there's a problem," I said, still keeping my cool. "You're installing cameras that point directly into my private property. That's not acceptable." The smile widened. "Actually, as HOA president, I'm implementing a new neighborhood security initiative. These cameras are for everyone's protection. The board approved it last week. This was news to me. I didn't receive any notification about a vote or a new security system." "Oh," she feigned surprise. "How strange. Everyone else received the email. Perhaps check your spam folder. Regardless, it's been approved. The cameras stay." I returned home and immediately checked the HOA bylaws. There was nothing that gave the board authority to install surveillance equipment directed at private properties without homeowner consent. I also reviewed my emails. No notification of any meeting or vote had been sent. Something felt very off about this whole situation. Later that day, I noticed not one, but 3 cameras positioned around Patricia's house, all conveniently angled to capture different parts of my property. One focused on my backyard patio, where I often worked, another on my side yard, and a third with a view of my front door and driveway. This went well beyond neighborhood security. It was targeted surveillance. I decided to approach this methodically. First, I sent a polite but firm email to Patricia and copied the entire HOA board, requesting the cameras be repositioned to exclude my private property. I cited relevant bylaws and privacy concerns. The response came suspiciously quickly. An online email stating that the security measures were implemented in accordance with community safety protocols and that no adjustments would be made. Something wasn't adding up. I reached out directly to other board members and discovered something interesting. There had never been an official vote on any security system. In fact, several board members seemed confused by my inquiry. When I explained about the cameras, they expressed concern, but also hesitation to contradict Patricia, who had apparently become quite the intimidating figure in the neighborhood. That evening, I decided to host a small gathering in my backyard with a few neighbors I'd become friendly with. As we sat around, enjoying some beers and grilling, I casually mentioned the new security initiative. To my surprise, no one had heard anything about it. My next-door neighbor on the other side, Mike, seemed particularly troubled. "She doesn't have cameras pointing at my yard," he said, frowning. "Just yours." "That's not right." "Weird, man." Another neighbor, JY, who lived across the street, leaned in. "Patricia has been talking about you at the community center, saying you're running some kind of suspicious business from home and that you have unusual visitors at odd hours." I nearly choked on my drink. "What?" "My only visitors are my sister, who drops by with my nephew sometimes, and occasional food delivery." Yen shrugged. I figure it was nonsense, but she's been really pushing this narrative that the neighborhood needs increased vigilance against unknown threats. After my guests left, I sat in my now uncomfortably exposed backyard, piecing things together. This wasn't about security. Patricia had specifically targeted me for surveillance and was possibly spreading rumors about my activities. The question was, what? The answer came the following week when I received an official letter from the HOA board, or more specifically, from Patricia on HOA letterhead. It outlined a new work-from-home policy that required residents to register their home businesses, pay additional fees for commercial use of residential property, and submit to periodic safety inspections. The kicker was the final paragraph, which stated that residents who failed to comply would face escalating fines and potential legal action. It became crystal clear Patricia wasn't just a power-hungry HOA president. She was trying to monetize her position by creating fake violations and extracting fees. I was likely her test case. If she could successfully implement these bogus rules with me, she'd move on to other work-from-home residents. The cameras weren't for security. They were her way of gathering evidence of my supposed violations. I'd had enough. It was time to fight back, but I needed to be smarter than Patricia. Direct confrontation would just play into her hands. Instead, I began gathering documentation of everything. Her cameras, the fake HOA communications, the testimonies from board members about the non-existent vote, and the suspicious new policies that weren't actually in our bylaws. I also did something Patricia clearly hadn't expected. I consulted a lawyer who specialized in property rights and privacy law. Jennifer Ramirez was recommended by a client of mine who had dealt with a similar situation. Our first meeting was enlightening. "What you're describing isn't just an HOA overreach," Jennifer explained, reviewing the photos I'd taken of the cameras. "In Virginia, directing surveillance equipment into someone's private property without consent, especially areas like a backyard where there's a reasonable expectation of privacy, potentially violates several laws. It could constitute invasion of privacy, harassment, and depending on what she's recording and how she's using it, possibly state wiretapping laws. So I can legally demand she remove them?" I asked. Jennifer smiled. "You could do better than that. Virginia code specifically prohibits video monitoring of a person's private property without consent when there's a reasonable expectation of privacy. What she's doing could actually be a Class 6 felony." I was genuinely shocked. I just want her to stop spying on me and drop these fake rules. "The severity of the potential charges gives you leverage," Jennifer explained. "But before we go nuclear, let's try a measured approach." Jennifer drafted a cease and desist letter that detailed the specific laws Patricia was violating. It demanded the immediate removal of all surveillance equipment directed at my property, a retraction of the false statements made about me and my work, and a clarification to the HOA board about the unauthorized policy changes. The letter made it clear that failure to comply within 72 hours would result in legal action, including potential criminal charges. I hand-delivered the letter to Patricia the next morning. The look on her face as she scanned the first few paragraphs was almost worth all the harassment I'd endured. Her complexion paled, but quickly reddened as she reached the part about potential criminal charges. "This is ridiculous," she sputtered. "You're threatening me for trying to keep our neighborhood safe. I'll have my attorney review this nonsense." "Please do," I said calmly. "I'll look forward to hearing from them." 72 hours, Patricia. As I walked away, I heard her front door slam with enough force to rattle her blessed home wreath. I had a feeling things were about to get worse before they got better. I was right. Within 24 hours, Patricia had called an emergency HOA meeting to discuss dangerous and threatening behavior from a resident. She didn't name me specifically in the email notification, but it was obvious who she meant. The meeting was scheduled for the following evening at the community center. I arrived early and was surprised to find nearly every homeowner in attendance. Patricia had unintentionally done me a favor by making the meeting sound so urgent. She'd lured a full house for what was about to unfold. She stood at the front of the room with two men I didn't recognize, likely the attorney she'd mentioned, and perhaps someone from the security company. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," Patricia began, her voice dripping with artificial concern. "As your HOA president, my primary concern is the safety and property values of our community. Recently, we've implemented important security measures that have been met with shocking resistance and threats from certain residents." I remained calm in my seat as whispers rippled through the crowd. Several people glanced in my direction. "This individual," Patricia continued, not quite meeting my gaze, "has threatened legal action against our board for simply doing our duty to protect our neighborhood. I've asked our association attorney to explain why our security measures are completely legal and appropriate." One of the men next to her stepped forward and introduced himself as Gregory Walsh, apparently Patricia's personal attorney rather than one retained by the HOA. He began a convoluted explanation about community interests superseding individual privacy concerns, citing cases that, as Jennifer had prepared me, were either irrelevant or actually supported my position. When he finished, Patricia asked if there were questions. I raised my hand. Patricia visibly hesitated before acknowledging me. "Yes, I do have some questions," I said, standing up. "First, I'd like to know when the board voted to install surveillance cameras specifically directed at my property." Patricia's smile tightened. "As I've explained to you, the security initiative was approved by the board." "That's interesting," I replied, "because I've spoken with every board member, and they all confirm no such vote ever took place. In fact, I've invited them to clarify this point on cue." Sarah Johnson, the HOA treasurer, stood up. "There was never a vote on any security system," she stated firmly. "The first I heard about cameras was when Daniel contacted me last week." Two other board members nodded in agreement. Patricia's face flushed. "There might have been some miscommunication," she began, but I gently interrupted. "My second question is about the new work-from-home policy that I and several other residents received. When was that voted on, and where is it documented in our bylaws?" Tricia's attorney whispered something in her ear, his expression concerned. "That policy is still in draft form and was sent prematurely," Patricia said quickly. "It's not being enforced at this time." "My final question," I continued, my voice still calm, but carrying throughout the now silent room, "is whether you were aware that directing surveillance equipment into a private residence or backyard where there's a reasonable expectation of privacy is a violation of Virginia code and potentially constitutes a Class 6 felony." The room erupted in murmurs. Patricia's attorney was now whispering more urgently in her ear, while the other man, presumably from the security company, was backing away slightly as if to distance himself from the situation. "That's a misrepresentation of the law," Patricia declared, though her voice had lost its authoritative edge. "Actually, it's not," came a voice from the back of the room. Jennifer had arrived right on schedule. She walked to the front and introduced herself as my attorney. "I've prepared copies of the relevant statutes for everyone's reference," as well as documentation of the unauthorized surveillance equipment currently directed at my client's property. She distributed papers to those nearby, who eagerly passed them along. Jennifer then addressed the security company representative directly. "Sir, I should mention that if your company knowingly installed equipment used for unlawful surveillance, you could potentially share liability. I'd suggest reviewing your work order and installation procedures." The man cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Our contract was for standard home security, not targeted. Surveillance will need to reassess this installation immediately." Patricia was now in a heated, whispered conversation with her attorney, who looked increasingly concerned. The room became a buzz of conversation as neighbors reviewed the legal information Jennifer had provided and discussed it amongst themselves. Sarah, the treasurer, called for order. "I think we need to officially address this situation. As a board member, I move that all unauthorized surveillance equipment be immediately removed and that we formally rescind any unofficial policy communications that weren't properly approved by the full board." The motion was quickly seconded and overwhelmingly approved by the homeowners present. Patricia, seeing the tide completely turn against her, attempted one last defense. "This is a misunderstanding," she insisted. "Everything I've done has been for the good of the community, including spreading false rumors about Daniel running some suspicious business," she asked Jen from across the room, "or claiming he has unusual visitors that none of us have ever seen." Other neighbors began speaking up, sharing their own stories of Patricia's overreach, invented rules, and selective enforcement. It seemed I wasn't the only one who'd been targeted, just the one who'd finally stood up to her. By the end of the meeting, not only had the homeowners voted to remove the cameras and invalidate Patricia's fake policies, but they'd also called for a special election to replace her as HOA president. Her attorney, clearly recognizing a losing battle, was already packing up his briefcase. The security company representative had made a hasty exit, presumably to avoid further liability discussions. As the meeting disbanded, several neighbors approached to thank me for speaking up. Some shared their own Patricia stories, while others admitted they'd been too intimidated to challenge her before. Mike clapped me on the shoulder. "Man, that was impressive," he said. "You stood up to the neighborhood tyrant without even raising your voice." Jennifer and I were preparing to leave when Patricia approached her, her attorney conspicuously absent. "This isn't over," she said, her voice low. "You've turned my neighbors against me with your exaggerations and legal intimidation." I shook my head. "Patricia, I didn't turn anyone against you. Your actions did that. All I did was shine a light on them." "The cameras will be removed tomorrow," she said stiffly. "I hope you're satisfied." "It's not about satisfaction," I replied. "It's about respecting boundaries and following actual rules, not making them up as you go. That's what an HOA is supposed to be, agreed-upon standards, not one person's power trip." She walked away without another word, her posture rigid with unresolved indignation. The aftermath was both swift and satisfying. The cameras were indeed removed the next day. The security company, eager to avoid any association with potential illegal surveillance, sent a different technician who appeared. I apologized profusely while dismantling the equipment. Patricia's attorney sent a formal retraction of all unauthorized policies to every homeowner, likely in an attempt to mitigate any potential legal repercussions for his client. The special election was held 2 weeks later. Sarah, the treasurer who had stood up at the meeting, was elected as the new HOA president on a platform of transparency and adherence to actual bylaws. Her first official act was to establish a communication protocol that required all HOA notices to be approved by at least 3 board members before distribution. As for Patricia, the consequences extended beyond just losing her position. The incident had revealed her pattern of misrepresenting HOA authority, and several homeowners came forward with stories of fines they had paid for violations that weren't actually in the bylaws. The board initiated an audit and found that Patricia had collected over $8,000 in unauthorized fines during her brief tenure. This led to a formal complaint with the County Property Management Board and an investigation into potential fraud. Patricia listed her house for sale 30 days later. The for sale sign went up without notice, and moving trucks arrived shortly after. She avoided any interaction with neighbors during the process, having a property management company handle the final details of her departure. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she'd moved to a condominium with no HOA. Perhaps she'd learned at least one lesson from the experience. The most positive outcome wasn't Patricia's departure, but the community that formed in her wake. Neighbors who had previously kept to themselves, intimidated by her aggressive monitoring, began interacting more freely. We started a monthly neighborhood cookout that rotated between houses. The HOA meetings, once sparsely attended, now regularly drew enough participants to make decisions truly representative of community wishes. As for me, I finally got my private backyard sanctuary back. The first weekend after the cameras came down, I hosted a privacy-restored party for the neighbors who had supported me. We laughed about the absurdity of the situation while acknowledging how easily one determined person had nearly succeeded in creating their own surveillance state. Jennifer, who stopped by the party briefly, put it best. What happened here is a reminder that rules and laws exist for everyone's protection, even the seemingly small ones about where you can point a camera. When we ignore them because they seem inconvenient or because we think our intentions justify breaking them, we undermine the very system that protects all our rights. 6 months later, Oakwood Heights is a different community. We still have an HOA and we still have rules, but they're the actual rules we all agreed to when we moved here, enforced with transparency and common sense rather than power trips and hidden cameras. Sarah has proved to be an excellent HOA president, focusing on genuine community improvements rather than micromanaging her neighbors. Sometimes I think about Patricia and wonder if she realizes how her actions backfired so spectacularly. Her attempt to control and monitor her neighbors not only failed, but united us against the very behavior she represented. In trying to catch me breaking rules that didn't exist, she ended up breaking real laws with serious consequences. The oak tree that started it all still stands in my backyard, perhaps a bit more symbolic now than before, for I installed a hammock beneath it last month. It's the perfect spot to relax, completely unobserved except by the occasional squirrel or bird. Privacy, I've come to appreciate even more deeply, isn't just about having nothing to hide. It's about having the space to simply be without performance or observation. As for HOA Karens with illusions of grandeur and illegal surveillance equipment, well, they might want to check the actual law before declaring themselves the neighborhood watchdog. Some boundaries aren't meant to be crossed, and some lines, once crossed, can't be uncrossed without serious consequences. Patricia learned that lesson the hard way, one felony-grade camera at a time.